This lecture review video examines the age of imperialism and World War I. 1850 might be a useful date for the beginning of our study of this unit, and particularly imperialism, and it's useful to put these two topics together because indeed imperialism and competition over international colonies was one of the causes of the First World War. We can conclude this unit in 1919 as the war itself ends in November of the previous year of 1918, and the very significant but controversial Treaty of Versailles occurred in 1919. Some of the important background information we need to understand regarding these events at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century includes an important shift in worldview among Europeans at the end of the 19th century, sometimes called modern consciousness. Whereas the age of the Enlightenment emphasized rationalism and the ability to think and philosophy and study and rational explanations of the natural laws of the universe, a firm belief that if we simply discover the natural, machine-like rational laws that compose and comprise the universe, then we will be able to understand life and create a perfect life. That type of thinking got rejected at the end of the 19th century, and we see a significant shift in worldview called modern consciousness. In modern consciousness, modern thinkers began to emphasize relativism, that truth is not something fixed, absolute, and objective that needs to be studied and experienced. It is rather whatever you think it is. It is relative to its context. It is constantly shifting. Nothing is absolutely scientifically necessarily true. Modern consciousness is also characterized by secular humanism. This is a different type of humanism than the humanism of the Renaissance. Whereas the humanism of the Renaissance celebrated the individual and creative human beings, human potential, human beauty, secular humanism does not believe that there is a God and believes that man is simply by himself. So whereas in the Renaissance, Michelangelo can paint the creation of Adam by an individual touch from the hand of God, you wouldn't see that in modern consciousness because there is no God in this worldview. Rather, as man is the measure of the universe and is left to himself. Another key idea of modern consciousness was social Darwinism. This was the misapplication, the extrapolation of Darwinian evolution to all areas of life, and particularly sociology. And so, whereas Darwin believed in the survival of the fittest and natural selection regarding the evolution of biology, social Darwinists believed those same ideas could be applied to society, survival of the fittest. And indeed, they would theorize that there are some people who are more evolved than others. That's why they are rich. Or there are some races that are more evolved. They are more fit than other races, and therefore they should conquer other kingdoms and they should rule the world. So it feeds part of the racism that is also common to modern consciousness and the belief that some races are more superior to others. Psychoanalysis is also part and parcel of modern consciousness and the belief that analysts and specialists can determine the subconscious hidden motivations for human behavior. Modern consciousness is also characterized by naturalism, that all that exists is the natural world. It is foolhardy and a waste of time to talk about spiritual speculations, that there really isn't a spiritual world out there with angels, demons, a god, or a devil. Rather, all that exists is simply what you see in front of us, the natural world. And then the modern consciousness is also characterized by biblical higher criticism, this new theology emerging particularly in Germany that rejects the authority of the Bible, the infallibility of the scriptures, rejects the miracles, the divinity of Jesus Christ, also his atonement, his resurrection from the dead, and the authority of Christianity. All these are important characteristics of this new thinking in modern consciousness. Just as the Age of Enlightenment and the thoughts of enlightened thinkers were fueled by Isaac Newton's laws and studies regarding gravitational pull in physics, so too we see that modern consciousness is really inspired by a misapplication of the study of modern physics. Whereas Newtonian physics was simply sometimes designated classical mechanics, and it had to do with such things as force and vectors and angles, something that we can something that we can analyze and see in the physical world. Modern physics is much more characterized by theory and extrapolation. We're really talking about something in the physical universe that can only be worked out on a blackboard. It's very speculative, and it involves extreme extrapolation of mathematical principles. This is sometimes what we call quantum physics, in which we are not examining, such as Newton perhaps did, an apple falling from a tree, but rather we're talking about very small atomic level particles, very small microscopic pieces of matter moving at very high, unobservable rates of speed. So all of this is theoretical. And what modern physicists discover is that on the atomic level and on the subatomic level, that indeed particles do not always perform in simply a rational mechanical manner. Sometimes particles of atoms demonstrate behavior that is not predictable, is not completely rational, and cannot be completely graphed on a scale. We see this in the works of Marie Curie, a famous physicist and chemist whose studies of radioactivity begins to open this field up. Also the work of Max Planck, whose work in quantum theory physics and his discovery of the Planck constant. And what Planck particularly theorizes is that the only constant is the lack of constancy, and that it is impossible to talk about the absolute rational predictable behavior, particularly of electrons, because electrons often act in unexpected ways. And we see the pinnacle of this type of thinking in the works of Albert Einstein and his work at Princeton University. Einstein did much mathematical work regarding quantum theory and physics at the subatomic level. And of course, many people were not actually reading the works of Einstein, but they have a small familiarity with his ideas, and then they extrapolate them to many other areas of life. A good example of that would be Herbert Spencer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and George Sorel. Herbert Spencer was a strong advocate of social Darwinism, and the evolutionary biology that Darwin advanced, Spencer simply applies to individuals and societies and says that some societies, some races are more superior than others, extrapolating Darwin's survival of the fittest ideas onto other areas of life. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, believed that life is full of irrationality and it is ridiculous to talk about laws of the universe and natural law as Newton and the Enlightenment philosophers did, and therefore he believed in a world of nihilism and irrationality. Indeed, he believed that Christianity was one of the most perverse corruptions of true thought. He called it an immortal blemish of mankind. And his famous quote is, "God is dead." Nietzsche was one of many thinkers at the turn of the century that advanced the idea that Christianity is really an invention of mankind because man is afraid to confront the universe by himself. He's scared, therefore he creates this comforting idea of an all-knowing God. But Nietzsche, as an advocate of nihilism and belief that there is nothing to the universe, no meaning, no point, no progress, it is irrational to even consider the fact that man is getting better or that man has hope. It really represents a new strain in modern conscious thinking. What Nietzsche did advocate for is not what he called the weak-willed elements of traditional Christianity, but rather called for a Übermensch, or a Superman, someone who will impose their will on society, demonstrate their will to power, and overcome the meaninglessness of the world as it truly exists. George Sorel seems to apply modern consciousness, particularly in the area of society, politics, and also economics, as he advocated worldwide socialist revolution, and that the ideas that the so-called laws that have governed so much of society in the past need to be overthrown, and there needs to be a new socialist order. We also see the attention to the irrational in the works of Sigmund Freud. Freud, a psychologist, wrote an important book called The Interpretation of Dreams, in which for the first time someone seriously was endeavoring to examine a patient's dreams, whereas dreams historically have been dismissed as simply random manifestations of someone in their subconscious. Freud believed there was great meaning in someone's dreams, and they needed to be interpreted because they revealed the basis of behavior of that individual having the dream. Therefore, he's considered the founder of psychoanalysis that examined the connections between the unconscious and patterns of behavior. Freud also developed his famous theory of personality, in which he said there's a conflict between the baser instincts of man and his more higher values. The id is the lowest level of man's personality, his natural cravings, his simple desires for hunger, thirst, and rest and self-indulgence. And the ego is the moral restrictions that society places on man. So there's always a conflict between the id and the ego, what I want to do and what I should do. And it is the superego, people who develop an advanced superego, is the moral referee between the id and the ego, negotiating these two elements. Other important thinkers in modern consciousness could also include Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Chamberlain becomes one of the most vocal anti-Semites at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Indeed, his ideas blame a lot of society's problems in politics and government on the Jews. Chamberlain, who's an English writer, of course, his thinking will be adopted on the continent on a large scale, particularly with the emergence of Nazi Germany. In Germany, we see the emergence of a new theology that rejects traditional Christianity and comes to believe that the Bible is really just a simple collection of stories, and the disciples, out of their great grief that Jesus had been crucified, came up with this idea that he had risen from the grave. In fact, Bultmann said perhaps all the disciples had the same hallucination, that they were all hallucinating at the same time when they saw Jesus, supposedly after his crucifixion. Therefore, Bultmann believes that Christianity is full of myths, and Christianity may have value. It may encourage people to love their neighbor, and maybe it has some valuable moral dimensions to it, but in the end, it is simply based on myth. So we see a rejection of the scriptures and rejection of traditional Christianity in this new theology emerging in Germany. So therefore, we can identify the prime prophets of modern consciousness as Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Sigmund Freud, and Rudolf Bultmann. Key thinkers in the worldview that is going to predominate into the 20th century, and frankly will lead to so much suffering, killing, genocide, poverty, and also human oppression that has become so characteristic of the 20th century. There is a key exception to these thinkers of modern consciousness, and within the Christian church, one of the more notable individuals would be Charles Spurgeon, sometimes known as the Prince of Preachers. Spurgeon was the pastor of a very large church in Victorian London, and Spurgeon stylized himself as a traditional Reformed Baptist minister who would preach sermons based on the scriptures and the theology of the Reformation and attract large crowds each Sunday to his church. And indeed, as much of 19th century Europe moves towards liberalism and secular theology, Spurgeon continues to teach the traditional gospel and sees many come to faith in Christ in his church in the famous Metropolitan Tabernacle. The other exception that we can see emerge in the Christian church is the work of William Booth in the formation of the Salvation Army. With so many problems of poverty and crime within Victorian cities, Booth became concerned for the welfare of these individuals and created the Salvation Army in an effort to clothe the naked and feed the poor and tend to the physical and spiritual needs of those that he viewed in the cities around him. To some extent, modern consciousness is exhibited and demonstrated in some of the prime artistic movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. This begins with Impressionism. Impressionism really rejected the realistic artistic movement that came before it and during it. And what we see in Impressionism is an attention to natural settings. Impressionistic artists love to play with light, and particularly the reflection of light against water. And then we see this movement gradually morph and expand into a greater points of emphasis of Impressionism into Post-Impressionism, which emphasized subjective feelings and emotional realities. Perhaps a good way to think about the difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is that Impressionism emphasized the impression the artist could see and therefore painted. Post-Impressionism emphasized the impression the artist felt and therefore endeavored to paint it. So Post-Impressionism is an expansion on Impressionism and emphasizes a greater subjectivity, which is characteristic of all the artistic movements from the late 19th century and across the 20th century. Good examples of impressionistic works include those of Claude Monet, in which the point of the artist here is to capture an impression of the scene and not an emphasis on detail, not an emphasis on precision. It's not necessarily like realism to highlight the dangers of modern industrial life, but the impressionistic artists were not averse to painting factory scenes, but rather it is simply the impression of the beauty of the colors, and again, often the colors bouncing off of water and reflection of light, and kind of almost a blurred image. With the development of photography, it was no longer necessary to paint as accurately and precisely as possible. A photograph could do that. Impressionistic artists were more interested in the impression that a certain scene or perception of a scene gave them. Van Gogh's Starry Night is probably the best example of post-impressionism, that clearly a night sky with stars doesn't look like this, but we get the idea of what the artist is trying to deliver. Van Gogh also painted self-portraits. We also see it in the work of Paul Cézanne, where it is much more, the scene is much more about what the artist felt when he saw this and endeavored to paint it. And I think a very good painting that demonstrates not only post-impressionism, but also the reality of modern consciousness is the famous painting by Edvard Munch, The Scream. In The Scream, we see a man in horror grasping his face, screaming, perhaps as a symbol of the reality of living in a world without God, without meaning, without progress, and without hope for tomorrow. An even heightened form of post-impressionism might be Cubism into the early 20th century. Cubists believe it is useless to have art represent reality, and the individual conscious is the source of all meaning, not scriptures, not God, not the state, not the king, not the pope or the church. The individual conscious, whatever is in the individual mind and feelings and affections, is most important. And therefore, Cubists would use geometric figures to as visual stimuli to recreate reality in the viewer's mind, and believe that the individual determines reality and meaning. We see that in the works of Pablo Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and also The Two Figures. Other important writers at the turn of the century would include the French writer Émile Zola. Zola was a playwright and a journalist, and a novelist, particularly in the realist tradition. Perhaps one of his most significant accomplishments was being a public advocate as a popular writer for the accused Alfred Dreyfus amidst the Dreyfus affair and helping to secure his release from the false charges against him. Very famous Russian author at the end of the 19th century, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had been imprisoned in a Siberian labor camp and had spent many years in prison, so he is fascinated by the human psychology, particularly amidst suffering, and what is the nature of the human condition, and what is the relationship between humans and God, and their attempt to create meaning of the world apart from God. We see this in his works Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov. Indeed, one of the most famous quotes of Dostoevsky was, "If there is no God, everything is permitted," which is really a stinging critique of modern consciousness, that if we remove the moral authority of God, then no one is in a position to tell someone else something is right or wrong or to enforce the law. Leo Tolstoy was also an important Russian writer in the second half of the 19th century with works such as Anna Karenina and his very long War and Peace, which cataloged events during Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. We also see a greater move towards subjectivism and impressionism in the music of Claude Debussy. Claude Debussy emphasized moods and haunting sensations, delicate beauty, the elegance of sound. And Debussy particularly represents a departure from the more mechanistic, predictable sounds, notes, and compositions, particularly Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the 18th century. The late 19th century is the great century of imperialism. Imperialism is the intention of European powers to create empires overseas. Now that Europe had really emerged out of the Middle Ages and had recovered the population it had lost in the bubonic plague of the 1300s, and had also experienced an agricultural revolution, and indeed massive population growth because of the Industrial Revolution, and a lower mortality rates, and a disposable income, and a measure of prosperity, in order to fuel the new industrialism and to take advantage of this new prosperity, European powers come to conclude that it's important to find colonies overseas that will produce many of the raw materials to fuel their society. Thus, there are many motivations for late 19th century imperialism, including competition between European powers. Indeed, this competition over colonies eventually will spill over into the competition of fighting the First World War. With the growth of modern navies, particularly fueled by steam power, and the necessity of having coaling stations to refuel those naval ships, many European powers are looking to create ports overseas or around the world. There's also a great and growing sense of nationalism that we've discussed before across the 19th century, pride in one's country. And a measure of that pride could be how many colonies your country could hold and dominate. We also see an emphasis on prestige and also this new idea of social Darwinism, that for some imperialists, there's the prevailing belief that the white races of Europe are more racially superior than those of Asia and Africa, and therefore the lower races need to be picked up and carried and also support the efforts of the more civilized Europeans. The 19th century is also the great century of missions and the dispatchment of European missionaries all around the world, far off corners, spreading the Christian gospel and also translating the scriptures. And of course, also this emphasis on natural resources to continue industrial development in Europe. An important poem and some of the important works that fueled some of this imperialistic thinking were written by Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was an English writer who composed a very famous Jungle Book. The Jungle Book was the story of Mowgli and a young boy who is raised in the wilderness. And as the story progresses, we see that Mowgli is actually the hero of the story, that despite the fact of not really having education and growing up in the wild, he seems to be more civilized than Europeans who have experienced the benefits of modern industrial life and also education. More famous was his famous poem, The White Man's Burden. In The White Man's Burden, Rudyard Kipling advanced the idea that it is the responsibility of Europeans, particularly white Europeans, to civilize lower races, particularly Asians and Africans, and bring them to a higher degree of civilization. And the poem is about the enormous challenges the Europeans would face in this task. Perhaps no other continent was the subject of so much examination and efforts to colonize, and really the implementation of a lot of the ideas of the white man's burden, than was Africa. In the 19th century, we see what is the so-called Scramble for Africa, the efforts of European powers to form colonies overseas in Africa and quickly divide up the continent. As a result, Africa is really redrawn with many new boundaries really based on European colonies. These boundaries, eventually, many of them will become African states in the 20th century, and the legacy of imperialism for the continent is that there emerges a lot of bitterness in what, for the Africans, were the artificial drawing of a lot of these boundaries. Important imperialists who brought early attention to Africa was Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes directs his attention particularly to the Cape Colony, or that of South Africa on the southern tip of the continent. Cecil Rhodes makes a fortune in the industrial diamond mines of the South, and indeed it leads to a lot of colonization in South Africa, in the Cape Colony, by the British, but also the Dutch. The Dutch are what were called the Boers, or the Afrikaners, settle in large numbers along the Cape Colony. But conflicts between the British and the Dutch eventually lead to the Dutch trekking north, moving north and founding additional settlements towards the north apart from the British. War was inevitable in the Cape Colony, however, and breaks out in 1899 with the Boer War. This is one of the larger colonial wars fought between the British and the Dutch. Indeed, the Dutch Boers or Afrikaners are overwhelmed by much more advanced British weapons. The British also practiced what's called scorched earth policy in an effort to destroy the supplies of the Dutch army in the Cape Colony. The British also set up large camps to imprison Dutch residents. In these camps, the conditions were often deplorable, and it leads to a lot of starvation and disease. The British are also using one of the more advanced weapons of the late 19th century, which was the Gatling gun, or repeating rifle, a forerunner of the machine gun. And often the local African tribes, the Zulus and the Xhosa, get caught up in this conflict between the two sides. Eventually, Britain wins the Boer War at a great loss of life and resources, but nevertheless secures control over the Cape Colony. Thereafter, the British endeavor to create a railroad that connects the Cape Colony all the way to Cairo, Egypt, in the north. And indeed, part of that effort to build that railroad takes place in the Sudan, with the British Army inflicting thousands upon thousands of loss against the local Sudanese in the Battle of Omdurman, in which the British are able to colonize and take control of the area that we would call Sudan today, linking finally the Cape Colony all the way to Cairo in the north for the construction of that railroad. Probably the most famous British explorer and missionary and zoologist of the 19th century with David Livingstone. Livingstone was born in Blantyre, Scotland, and worked in the mills as a child as a piecer, piecing threads together. He is self-taught, self-educated, and decides he wants to be a missionary, but not just a missionary, a medical missionary. Indeed, he is inspired by Robert Moffat, who had done missions in the Cape Colony, and alerted Livingstone to the reality of thousands of villages of those who had never heard of Christ and never heard of his gospel. Therefore, Livingstone launches onto a very famous 19th century career as an explorer, a map maker, and also a missionary. He's responsible for the discovery of Victoria Falls, which forms part of the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe today. Livingston, as he traveled extensively across Africa, is horrified by the slave trade and really brings international attention to efforts to abolish the slave trade within the interior of Africa. Livingston endures incredible hardship in his travels across Africa, traveling tens of thousands of miles, often by foot, enduring African fevers and diseases. He was blinded in one eye. His shoulder was damaged in the attack by a lion. His skin was scorched from the African sun, and his feet were incredibly callous from walking so many miles, and many of his teeth had fallen out from the coarse African corn he had to eat. Indeed, after traveling thousands of miles, he was often carried by African helpers from village to village, where he was propped up against a tree, where he would preach the gospel, read the scriptures, and also provide whatever medical care he could. Historians believe that David Livingstone quite possibly converted very few people, perhaps only one individual, who was probably Seychelles I, the ruler of the Quena people of what is called Botswana today. The significance of that one conversion would be, though, that Seychelles was important in the conversion of his own people and promoted Christianity among his own ranks. And the map-making efforts of David Livingstone really lead to much more 19th century expansion, colonization, but particularly missionary activity. After traveling thousands of miles, eventually Livingstone is lost in the African bush, depleted of food, depleted of his medicines, and also completely exhausted. The outside world believed that Livingstone was dead, but J. Gordon Bennett, who was the editor of the New York Herald, dispatched one of his reporters, Henry Morton Stanley, to go find Livingstone. And indeed, after a costly expedition into the interior of Africa, Stanley indeed does discover Livingstone at what we would call Ujiji, Tanzania, and encounters him with the famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." That site is still marked today. Livingstone is instrumental in converting Stanley to Christianity. They embark on some expeditions together until they finally part ways. Livingstone was responsible for mapping much of the interior of Africa, river routes, local tribes, the reality of the slave trade, but also Victoria Falls and also lakes in the interior of Africa. Livingstone, after a lifetime of travel and walking on his feet across Africa and opening so much of the so-called Dark Continent to the rest of the world, died in 1873 while praying on his knees in a hut. His supporters adored him so much in Africa that they removed his heart, had it buried in Africa, whereas the rest of his body was returned to England and is now buried in Westminster Abbey. Therefore, the English control so much of the African continent, building that railroad connecting Cairo to the Cape Colony. The French are also involved in the colonization of Africa, particularly in West Africa. French West Africa was desired particularly for its reservoirs of oil and also the ability to grow rubber trees in West Africa. Generally, the French are considered very oppressive colonizers, and indeed there is less self-government in French colonies than there was in British colonies. The Germans only reluctantly get involved in the colonization of Africa. Indeed, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck famously says that he didn't believe there was much value in colonies, but they are, quote, good for elections, unquote. Therefore, we see a German presence in the coasts of Africa, particularly in German East Africa. We also see a strong Belgian presence in the center of Africa. Belgium at this time was a monarchy under the rulership of King Leopold II, and the Congo is colonized as a personal possession of Leopold II. Indeed, much of the Congo was explored and had its boundaries demarcated by Henry Morton Stanley after meeting David Livingstone in the interior of Africa. The Congo was very much valued because of its gold reservoirs, also oil, and also rubber trees. However, the treatment of the Belgians towards the people of the Congo is so brutal and so controversial, often witnessing many executions and local natives having their hands and their arms cut off by the Belgians, that finally the Belgian parliament took the colony away from the king in 1908 and ensured that there would be more justice and a more equitable rulership of the Belgian Congo. Famous sea captain of the age of imperialism was the British sea captain James Cook. James Cook circumnavigated the world, made many journeys, particularly across the Pacific and also the South Atlantic. He was very instrumental, particularly in the discovery of the Hawaiian Islands, until a revolt among the Hawaiians leads to his death, and indeed he is murdered on the beach in the Hawaiian Islands. But he is instrumental in bringing British attention to the South Pacific, and particularly the formation of his colony of Australia and also New Zealand. Australian is founded as a penal colony, a criminal colony, where criminals from Great Britain were dispatched to Australia, often to work shearing sheep or to fill the prisons in Australia. Some of the more unsavory characters that Great Britain didn't want on the mainland, they simply dispatched to Australia or to prisons on the island of Tasmania or New Zealand. This leads to the colonization of Australia, leads to conflict with the local natives, who are known as the Aboriginals, and the Aboriginals eventually are forced to submit under British rule. The real prize gem of the British Empire was India. The British had been involved in India for a long time, dating all the way back to the early 1700s. And some of the earliest activity for the British involving India were particularly connected to a government corporation known as the East India Company. The East India Company was instrumental in delivering natural resources such as tea and cotton from India to fuel industrialism in Great Britain, and also the demand for tea throughout the British Empire. However, India is full of native groups that are often in conflict with each other, in conflict with the British, particularly Muslim and Hindu religious groups, came into conflict with the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. Many Hindu soldiers were drafted into the British Army and forced to serve. Unknown to those Hindu and some Muslim soldiers, however, a rumor spreads that the sealant on the rifle cartridges issued to the members of the British Army was sealed with beef or pork fat, and thus the removal of that fat involves soldiers biting on the seal of the rifle cartridge, removing the seal. Well, for Hindus who believe that the cow was sacred and would not eat beef, and Muslims who, in their religion, prohibit the eating of pork, this was, of course, in violation of their religion. So this is one of the reasons why it leads to conflict. The Sepoy Mutiny is eventually put down rather violently by the British Army in 1857. Two of the greatest legacies of the British imperial presence in India is the abolition of two traditional practices in Indian society. One would be suti. Suti is the process of widow burning, requiring that upon the death of her husband, a widow would be forced to jump on the funeral pyre and be burned, really executed, alongside her dead husband. This practice was often described to be voluntary, but many British imperialists recognize and observe that indeed it is not quite voluntary. And so as a result, the British imperialists are able to pass new laws preventing the practice of suti. We also see them pass laws prohibiting the practice of female infanticide, with so many Indian families really preferring to have a baby boy over a baby girl. Many Indian families would resort to killing the baby girl. This policy was also abolished by the British. The most famous British missionary to be sent to India was William Carey. William Carey was a Baptist missionary, and he begins the translation of the scriptures in Bengali and other Indian languages, sets up an important mission house, and is also instrumental in expanding the university system in India as well. India, as the crown jewel of the British Empire, grants Queen Victoria a gift in 1876 when she is designated the Empress of India from 1876 to her death amidst great fanfare. To the east, the Russian Empire continues to expand and consolidate its holdings over its large landmass, but really does not embark on the process of creating too many colonies in the late 19th century. Russia does find itself in war with a growing power to the east in Japan. Japan, after ending its self-imposed isolation with the Meiji Restoration in the 1850s, embarks on a rapid growth in industrialization and also the construction of a navy. That navy is used against the Russian Navy in the surprise attack against Port Arthur in 1904. Indeed, 2 Russian fleets are wiped out by the Japanese Navy in the course of the Russo-Japanese War, a huge embarrassment for Russia, and marking the first time that an Asiatic power had defeated a European power in world history, much to the humiliation of the Russians and the pride of the Japanese. Eventually, the war is ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth negotiated by the American President Theodore Roosevelt, in which Japan continues to expand its empire, and it is clear that Russia, and particularly its monarchy, is gradually, increasingly showing weakness. China also experiences attempts at colonization across the 19th century. The British and the British Navy are some of the first traders and colonizers to arrive in China, launching 2 of what become known as the Opium Wars. With opium being grown in their colony of India, the British were interested in making a profit and selling the opium to the Chinese. Eventually, when ports are reduced and access to opium is reduced, the British go to war against the Chinese, very quickly overwhelming them in order to make them purchase more of their opium. Indeed, more and more European powers are getting involved with a very vigorous trade with China and threatening to carve up the territory of China and create individual colonies. This process of colonization and dividing up China is blocked by the American Secretary of State, John Hay. John Hay issues what becomes known as the Open Door Notes, which kept China as an open door, not a closed door with firm colonies as the continent of Africa had become, but rather an open door in the sense that each European power could not create individual colonies in China, but they could exercise a lot of influence over their trading ports, have spheres of influence where they would enjoy exclusive trading rights. Most famous missionary to travel to China was Hudson Taylor, who is an Englishman, but who adopted Chinese dress and customs in order to remove cultural barriers for the expansion of the gospel. With so much foreign trading presence and also the presence of thousands of Christian missionaries, a secret martial arts society emerges in China known as the Boxers that launches an extended rebellion against foreign presence in China. Indeed, the Boxers would go from village to village executing those by beheading who supported foreigners or who had converted to Christianity, or the missionaries themselves, or some of the foreign merchants as well. Eventually, the United States and Japan, Great Britain, and France are forced to dispatch troops to protect their nation's peoples in amidst China from the Boxers. Colonization also takes place across Southeast Asia. It is particularly the French that get involved in creating a colony in Southeast Asia known as Indochina, later renamed Vietnam. This is a very valuable colony because the French realized that they can take rubber trees native to Africa, plant them in the Southeast Asia, and enjoy large profits from the rubber plantations in Southeast Asia. It's also worth noting the United States also embarks on a policy of colonization in the late 19th century, forming colonies in Puerto Rico and also the Philippines, and also securing control of the Hawaiian Islands, purchasing Alaska and many islands across the Pacific that will be important during World War II. Thus, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we see that much of Africa and Asia and the Pacific has really been designated as a colony or a sphere of influence, a trading zone for many of the European powers, and represents the height the extent of their empires. The Belle Epoque, the beautiful era that seemed to dominate late 19th century, early 20th century affairs in Europe with enormous prosperity and expansion of economies and expansion of colonies and so forth, of course, will come to an abrupt halt in 1914 with the outbreak of war. By 1914, in many ways, Europe was a tinderbox. There were a lot of concerns in each country about minorities and divisions. We see a very weak monarchy in Russia. There's a mixed nationalities problem, particularly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Kaiser William II, who's the monarch of Germany, Imperial Germany, has the largest army in the world with 1 million men under arms. The people of Ireland secretly want to be granted home rule, which is interrupted by the outbreak of World War I. And gradually, the concert of Europe and the Holy Alliance that had prevented war all the way back since 1815, the Congress of Vienna, 99 years, begins to break down at the end of the 19th century. We see the emergence of new alliances and the repositioning of new groups, particularly through the influence of Otto von Bismarck. And we see really two sides emerging by 1914 in Europe. The Triple Alliance, which included Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Triple Entente, which included England, France, and Russia, and then later Italy. These alliances are going to be very important for the coming of World War I, which indeed breaks out in 1914 and will last until November of 1918. There are many long-term causes of World War I, including nationalism, extreme pride in your country, these alliance systems that force countries to go to war even if they don't have a vested interest or a grievance against another nation, militarism, emphasis on arms buildup, and also the competition over colonies, and then internal conflicts within nations, various minority groups looking for their own independence, the creation of their own country, and indeed self-determination. Those are some of the long-term causes of the First World War. Europe was a tinderbox in the summer of 1914, waiting for a spark. That spark comes with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The Archduke had planned a trip to travel down to Serbia, one of the many areas controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with his wife, and indeed gets in his motor car, and on June 28, 1914, traveling through the streets of Sarajevo, he is unaware that there are many threats against his life, particularly on the ground that day, as a terrorist organization known as the Black Hand that seeks a free and independent Serbia. A member of that Black Hand terrorist organization was Gavrilo Princip. And Princip, with his revolver, walks up to the open-air car in which the Archduke was sitting and riding with his wife and fires a shot, killing the Archduke as well as his wife. Gavrilo Princip is quickly arrested. Ironically, the Archduke's first words upon being shot are "Es ist nichts," which means "it is nothing," believing that the wound is nothing. And indeed, is very much something, because the Archduke dies from the gunshot, and it leads to the explosion of forces that lead to World War I. So in response to Serbia's assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum against Serbia, demanding more control over the country, and also the restriction of a lot of its freedoms and the imposition of martial law. This policy and ultimatum angers Russia, who had an interest in protecting Slavs and Slavic Orthodox Christians everywhere, promises to go to war against Austria-Hungary. And because Germany is allied with Austria-Hungary, Germany declares war against Russia upon their mobilization. And because France is allied with Russia, Germany declares war against France. And because when Germany invades France, they move through Belgium. Belgium's allied with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom declares war against Germany. So as a result, this small isolated event of this assassination in the Balkans leads to a confluence of events. The dominoes fall, and Europe descends into war in the fall of 1914. The war is met with great enthusiasm. It's been 99 years since there's been a continental Europe-wide war. There's great enthusiasm. Many young Europeans believe this will be the last great war. There'll never be another war. And therefore, they kiss and hug their girlfriends and wives and say goodbye. Many of them are afraid not to go because they'll have to live with the everlasting shame that they didn't make it to the last great war, and they're going to have to go back to their own villages and endure that humiliation. One individual very excited to go off to war is a young Adolf Hitler, who will serve in World War I as delivering messages and will also be injured in a gas attack. World War I is very different than any of the European wars that came before it. It is what we call total war. That involves the total population, the total resources of a country, and is not simply fought by a specialized, well-trained army. We see the total war in the imposition of conscription, which is the formation of a draft, and it's not voluntary, but rather required to go off to war. Rationing, which fell hardest on women and children, that access to food and supplies wasn't always readily available. Many industries are nationalized or taken over by European governments for the war effort, and those same governments impose strict wage and price controls. Governments in Europe also produce a lot of propaganda advertising the merits of the war and encourage support for the war. Many women are involved in industries that are important for the development of weapons, and also labor unions work to cooperate with employers, producers, and the government to avoid strikes. In their recurring desire to have home rule and form an independent Irish republic, the Irish, who do not commit to World War I, endeavor to rise up in the midst of the war in an event called the Easter Rebellion, thinking that the British soldiers far off fighting the war will not be able to squelch their rebellion. However, the rebellion is quickly put down, and Irish independence will wait again until after the war. The plan for the Germans at the beginning of World War I was known as the Schlieffen Plan, a plan formed by Count Alfred von Schlieffen in which there would be a large army keeping the right strong that would quickly invade, march through Belgium, and descend on Paris and quickly win the war. However, that plan is not executed properly, as the Germans really do not keep the right side of their front strong and commit numerous atrocities as they march through Belgium in an event known as the Rape of Belgium, including the execution of common citizens, mass executions by firing squad by the German army, the rape of some Belgian women, and also the destruction of some historically invaluable libraries in Belgium. As a result, British and then later U.S. propaganda makes great hay about this rape of Belgium, and indeed, the rape of Belgium is going to be one of the reasons the United States will get into the war in 1917. Nevertheless, the German army quickly moves through Belgium, only meeting stiff resistance by the British, who quickly cross the English Channel and come to the continent at the Battle of Mons. At Mons, we see the destructive effects of the machine gun against the German army, in which somewhere around 500 German conscripts are wiped out in just a matter of minutes, unaware that warfare has changed. The Germans quickly push back the English and French forces, and they are not stopped until somewhat north and east of Paris in what becomes known as the Miracle of the Marne. Along the Marne River, the British and French are finally able to stop the German advance. The advance is stopped, but both sides begin to trench north and south in an effort to outflank the other, and therefore a series of trenches are constructed all the way from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. The last battle in the process of this trenching occurs at Ypres in the northern part of Belgium and right near the English Channel. At Ypres is the first example of the Germans using a gas attack, particularly against British and Canadian soldiers. Therefore, for much of World War I, the Western Front is a series of trenches. These trenches really don't move. Massive battles are fought involving shelling and infantry attacks, but yet rarely does the trench move except for a few hundred feet or perhaps a couple miles over the course of a long campaign. Therefore, Europe settles into a stalemate of extended trench warfare with trenches from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border, often living in horrific conditions, with much of the landscape destroyed by artillery and additional fighting and battles, and the land in between the trenches becoming known as no man's land. This would be the area between the trenches, both armies would charge in order to attack each other's trenches, often with futility. These trench fortifications become more expanded, and indeed sometimes concrete bunkers are formed to the rear. They become increasingly reinforced on both sides. In World War I, we see new technologies, new weapons of war over the course of the war. The most fearsome would probably be gas, chlorine gas and also mustard gas, introduced by the Germans, but also used by other sides as well in an effort to drive out soldiers from enemy camps. Gas was enormously unpredictable, but also very lethal, often settling quickly to the ground and affecting the wounded even worse than the living. But nevertheless, chlorine gas, which caused massive respiratory failure and scorching, mustard gas, which caused horrific lesions on the skin, was one of the more feared elements and weapons of World War II. Many of these gas canisters are fired, or explosive shells fired, with much larger guns and howitzers than ever before, some of them requiring an entire railroad car to move the size of these guns. To break the stalemate, the British had invented the new weapon of the tank. The tank was supposed to push through the trenches and the barbed wire and move against enemy armies. However, these tanks often fill with carbon dioxide, often break down, are very unreliable, and often have thin armor, resulting in even greater loss of life and putting soldiers at even greater risk. The trenches throughout the Western Front are reinforced with barbed wire, which was invented on the American frontier to keep cows in, now used on the battlefront to keep men out. It is the British that bring the Gatling gun to World War I, but it is the Germans that perfect it with the development of the water-cooled machine gun, and then also later the sub-machine gun. Other armies also developed flamethrowers, which shot a stream of flame in an effort to drive out troops from reinforced trenches, and the British also incorporate Welsh coal miners who dug long tunnels beneath enemy trenches and then packed them with explosives, igniting them and blowing up enemy trenches with the men contained therein, forming large craters in the earth, some of which still remain today. World War I is also the first war fought with aviation, the development of the airplane for reconnaissance, but also air-to-air combat and also ground strafing. The most famous fighter pilot of World War I was the German ace Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, who shot down 80 enemy aircraft until he himself was shot down by a pistol from the ground. Other items used for reconnaissance included blimps or balloons flying over enemy trenches. On the seas, World War I is fought with ironclad ships exclusively. The age of sail has ended, and it is the British Navy, the largest and best in the world, that creates the dreadnought, the large iron steam-powered ship with very large guns across its deck. The largest naval battle of World War I takes place against British and naval forces at the Battle of Jutland off the coast of Denmark. Meanwhile, the Germans endeavor to counteract the advantage the British have on the high seas with their use of Unterseeboots, or U-boats, submarines that sink merchant ships supplying resources from the United States, and also destroying British naval vessels, therefore making the waters around the British Isles a war zone and indeed a killing zone in which many American and British ships are sunk. The most famous of which was the Lusitania, which on May 7, 1915, after departing from the port of New York, crosses the Atlantic and a few miles off the Irish coast is struck with a torpedo. It quickly sinks within 20 minutes and leads to large loss of life, including 128 Americans, and a lot of anger in the United States against the against the German submarine force. Two realities of warfare we see emerge for the first time in World War I are shell shock and trench foot. Shell shock was what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder today, an involuntary neurological response, a nervous breakdown of the body's neurological system after being subject to constant shelling and conflict. The other is trench foot. Because soldiers fail to replace their socks and keep their feet dry, it often leads to a gangrenous condition that leads to rot on the feet of the soldiers. Nevertheless, the battles and the shelling and the fighting continues on the Western Front through 1915 and 1916, including the Battle of Verdun, which witnessed a massive artillery assault by the German army against the French lines. Eventually, French soldiers will mutiny at the number of 1 million, so exhausted and so frustrated by warfare on the Western Front. The British endeavored to break through the stalemate, launching the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916, which saw weeks and weeks of shelling of the German entrenchments day and night, and the promise to the British soldiers that they would simply have to jump out of their trenches and walk across no man's line, carrying their rifle, not even firing it. However, they didn't get 100 yards from the trench. The German fortifications were much better fortified than realized, and it leads to mass slaughter. Germany and Austro-Hungary are also fighting a war on the Eastern Front against the very dilapidated and incompetent Russian Empire. The Eastern Front moves much better because of the inefficiencies of the Russian army, and the Russians are constantly pushed back by the advancing Germans and Austrians. In order to break the deadlock on the Western Front, the British, and particularly Winston Churchill, Chairman of the Admiralty, launches the idea of attacking the Central Powers through the Ottoman Empire and moving against Turkey. Therefore, a large British force moves up through the Aegean Sea near Greece and attacks the Turks on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which extended near the capital of the Ottoman Empire at Constantinople. However, the logistics of this campaign were not properly planned and executed, and indeed the Navy does not shell the coast sufficiently against the Turk fortifications, and therefore the Gallipoli campaign becomes a disaster for the British Army as New Zealanders and Australian troops have to scale incredible heights as they are being shot and gunned down by Turkish forces from the north, until in humiliation and defeat the British are forced to withdraw their troops. Meanwhile, the front continued to advance for the Germans on the east, pushing back the poorly commanded Russians and scoring a major victory at the Battle of Tannenberg. There is also war in the Middle East between British forces and also the Ottoman masters of the Middle East. And we also see horrific genocide, a forerunner of World War II, in the Armenian Holocaust, in which the Turkish army executes somewhere around 1.5 million Armenians simply because of their race and ethnicity. A key telegram is intercepted by the British in 1916 from the German foreign minister to the Mexican ambassador. This is known as the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a secret piece of correspondence in which the German army promised to give Mexico back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the states in the American Southwest, if the United States joined the war against Germany and joined on the German side, and therefore made this promise. This, as a result, outrages the United States. And so, in April of 1917, finally the United States also gets involved in World War I. Motivations for U.S. involvement in World War I included the rape of Belgium, the German atrocities they committed in their conquering of Belgium. Also, the sinking of the Lusitania, which saw 128 Americans killed, the sinking of that ship. The economic interests of the United States, in that they had been supplying the Allies and they needed the Allies to win the war so they could be paid back those debts. The release of the Zimmermann Note, and also the announcement by the German Foreign Office of a new policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Therefore, President Woodrow Wilson goes before the United States Congress and asks for a declaration of war. This will see the introduction of 4 million young American men, nicknamed the Doughboys, load onto ships and travel overseas to join the war effort. The American Marines make a important contribution to the war right away by stopping a new German advance in the Battle of Belleau Wood after taking heavy casualties. But finally, after regrouping and hundreds of thousands of Americans arriving in France, the large Meuse-Argonne offensive is launched in September of 1918 and will push the German army finally out of France and back towards Germany in a large-scale offensive along the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. Americans are key to holding the right flank of this large advancement, And the Battle of Amiens, one of the last battles of the war, sees the British use tanks on a large scale in an effort to push back the German army into Germany. And indeed, realizing that Germany was starving, was out of resources, and faced an Allied invasion, the Kaiser announces his abdication, much to the jubilee and the celebration of the crowds. And Germany signs an armistice, an agreement to stop shooting at a railroad car in Compiègne, France. This same railroad car will be used by Adolf Hitler later on when the French surrender to the Germans in 1940. As a result, there are great celebrations as the armistice has been signed. However, in Germany, there is a revolution, and they end their monarchy. Indeed, Kaiser William retreats in exile to the Netherlands, where he'll live as a lumberjack the rest of his life. And a new, fragile democracy, a republic, the Weimar Republic, is created in Germany. Thereafter, in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference is held. The point of the Paris Peace Conference is to resolve all the differences of the war and promote a lasting peace. 4 million Parisians and other Europeans come out to greet the American president, Woodrow Wilson, in anticipation and excitement of the peace he had promised in his famous peace program he had introduced during the war called the 14 Points. The 14 Points included many points promoting freedom. That included freedom of diplomacy, freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, freedom from large arms buildup, freedom for colonies, also freedom for the peoples of the German Empire, freedoms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, freedoms of the Ottoman Empire and the breakup of those large empires, and a new General Association of Nations, a League of Nations that will help resolve international disputes. Indeed, the 4 heads of states of the winning powers, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy, Georges Clemenceau, President of France, and also Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, convene in Paris and negotiates the ends of the deal. Woodrow Wilson promised a program of peace and wanted World War I to be the last war and wanted a program set up that would prevent future wars. The European heads of states, however, are much more interested in enacting their revenge and vengeance against the Germans for the war. Therefore, the controversial Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, is really a mix of programs and efforts to prevent an additional war, but also to punish Germany. It really is conflicted and has 2 ends. The most egregious part of the treaty was probably the imposition of then later $33 billion imposed on Germany for reparations that they had to pay to the Allies. The Germans were also forced to submit to massive arms reductions and agree not to build up an army or navy again, and also had to sign off on the guilt clause in which they had to acknowledge that the war was exclusively and entirely all their fault. In the treaty, buried are some provisions about self-determination for peoples. By that, the Allies really meant self-determination for the various nationalities that composed the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, and not the colonies that belonged to the British and the French. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson gets his final idea of the League of Nations as part of the treaty, an international body that will resolve disputes and prevent future conflicts. So it is with great humiliation that the Germans are forced to submit to this treaty, facing an Allied invasion, which humiliates and angers the German population and, of course, will lead to resentments and the rise of the Nazis across the 1920s and into the 1930s. Thus, the map of Europe is completely redrawn and redesigned as a result of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. We see a reduction of the Empire of Germany. We see the abolition of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also the Ottoman Empire. We see the formation of new states from the north in the Baltic Sea, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Poland, which had been partitioned at the end of the 18th century, now reemerges as a free and independent state as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. The country of Czechoslovakia is created. Also independent countries, and much smaller, of Austria and Hungary. And also Romania, Yugoslavia, with many mixed nationalities and many mixed resentments against each other. And also the new country of Turkey. Also, new countries are created under the mandate of British or French authority in the Middle East, including Syria, Iraq, and also Jordan. So, therefore, even though there were recriminations and vengeance certainly a part of the Treaty of Versailles, President Woodrow Wilson hoped that the League of Nations, the 14th point of his 14 points, would ensure peace and negotiation among nations, and further conflict would be avoided. Many countries, including the Allies, joined the League of Nations into the 1920s, but Woodrow Wilson, whose idea the League of Nations was, returns to the United States, and a Republican Congress refuses to join the League of Nations, refuses to promise to get involved in every European squabble that could lead to war in the future. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson, after a cross-country tour with speeches promoting adoption of the League, suffers a massive stroke, forced to return to the White House, where he is incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. The United States never joins the League of Nations, and therefore it is really a weak international body and does not prevent an additional war in the future. The entire world community was shocked in the course of World War I in 1917 that Russia falls into revolution. It's not that Russia wasn't a dilapidated 18th century power in the 20th century, and its armies had completely been humiliated and suffered catastrophic losses over the course of World War I. But the result of the Russian Revolution and the emergence of a communist state was horrifying to the rest of the Europeans. Russia, as it entered the 20th century, was led by the very inept and passive Tsar of Nicholas II. Although he is very much in love with his wife, who bore him 4 daughters and 1 son, he is completely detached from the events of government. We see that and his indifference to his people's suffering in the events of Kodinka Field. On the day of his coronation, people are trampled in celebration of the event. In 1905, Russia had suffered a small revolution known as the Revolution of 1905, which started with the events of Bloody Sunday, in which there was a peaceful protest to the Winter Palace, but the Tsar, misinterpreting the event, orders the army to fire into the protesters, gunning them down, unarmed protesters, leading to even more bitterness and resentment against the Tsar. The Tsar is required to consent to the formation of an Imperial Duma, or Russian parliament, in 1905, but that parliament is very weak, and the Tsar disbands them whenever he chooses and doesn't really follow their instruction. Nicholas is far more concerned with the plight of his family, particularly the heir to the throne, Alexei. Alexei is born with hemophilia, the inability of the blood to clot, and as a result, this becomes a state secret, as the Tsar and his wife do not want the people to view him as a weak and passive ruler. Therefore, Tsar Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, is willing to bring into the royal family Grigory Rasputin, a notorious womanizer and drunk, but nevertheless promises healing powers, who has the power to heal Alexei of his hemophilia and indeed stop the bleeding when it starts. However, the Russian population and the rest of the Russian government is horrified that a man of such low moral character has such access to the royal family. Therefore, in 1917, revolution breaks out in Russia with many causes, including hundreds of years of oppressive czars, the embarrassing loss in the Russo-Japanese War, also massive food and wage strikes with huge starvation, unemployment, and dislocation in Russia, the threat of Bolshevism, which was working to undermine the government, a significant and deep economic depression, and also the complete disaster of World War I, in which the Russian army, characterized by poor training, few resources, numerous mutinies, and the Tsar taking command of a retreating army, leads to 2 million military deaths and another 1.5 million civilian deaths. There are large-scale mutinies in the Russian army, refusing to obey the Tsar's orders anymore. And meanwhile, on the home front, there's great concern because Rasputin is exercising large influence over the Russian family, even accusations of him sleeping with the Tsarina and the royal daughters. Therefore, it is the Tsar's nephew, Felix Yusupov, who invites the unwitting Rasputin to his palace in St. Petersburg with a group of conspirators and shoots Rasputin with the group of conspirators and effects his murder in December of 1916. As a result, all of revolution breaks out in Russia in 1917. We see the March Revolution, in which a general strike is declared in St. Petersburg. All workers stop going to work. All factories shut down. All army officers refuse to obey their commander's orders. Everyone defects against the authority of the Tsar, which provokes his abdication, the end of the Romanov dynasty on March 15th, 1917, and the abdication of Nicholas II. This is the first stage of the Russian Revolution. The second stage was the creation of a provisional government. Provisional meaning temporary. A group of ministers, government leaders, would work with the State Duma or parliament, which replaced Nicholas II. The effective leader of the provisional government was Alexander Kerensky. In many ways, the provisional government was doomed from the start, however, because it makes the catastrophic choice of continuing Russia's involvement in World War I and does not sue for peace against the Germans. As a result, Russia experiences greater losses and greater death on the battlefield. The provisional government is also significantly weakened by the continual attacks of communists formed into workers' councils called Soviets across the country, the largest being the St. Petersburg Soviet. These group of workers eventually split into two groups. The Mensheviks, who wanted reform but weren't as violent, wanted to work within the existing system, and the Bolsheviks, who were much more violent, demanded immediate reform, including the necessity of shedding blood. The Bolsheviks are led by a very capable leader, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had been arrested previously. He had been deported and sent in exile into Switzerland. Lenin develops his ideas that Marx's revolution of a communist state will not come to full realization unless a strong party leads the workers to revolution and a communist state. This is the idea behind Leninism. Therefore, Lenin creates a strong Bolshevik party while even operating outside of the country in Switzerland. Eventually, the German army is instrumental in returning Lenin to Russia, knowing that he will provoke revolution. Lenin promises the Russian people exactly what they wanted to hear: peace from the war, land to work on their own fields, and bread for a starving population. Lenin is led by the capable intellectual and leader of the Red Army, Leon Trotsky. Therefore, with the provisional government incredibly weak amidst its defeats in World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, sometimes called the October Revolution, is effected on October 25th, 1917, in which Bolshevik Red Guards storm the Tsar's Winter Palace and arrest members of the provisional government, seize control of the Duma and shut it down, and as a result proclaim the first communist state in world history. This plummets Russia, who had already experienced so much deprivation, death, and defeat and humiliation in the early 20th century under the Tsar and also under the provisional government, into a grueling civil war between supporters of the Bolsheviks, known as Reds, and whites who opposed a Bolshevik takeover. The Russian Civil War will lead to the loss of millions of more lives, also including the life of the Tsar and his family, who were relocated to escape from the Bolsheviks, or to escape from the whites by the Bolsheviks at the Apatiev house in Yekaterinburg. And on July 17, 1918, their entire family is executed in the middle of the night by Bolshevik Red Guards, their bodies not to be discovered until the early 1990s and not buried until 1998 in the Peter and Paul Fortress. Also, in the midst of the Russian Civil War, deprivation and famine continues to rack Russia between these two sides. Finally, in 1922, the Bolshevik, or Reds, secure control over the country. During the course of the Civil War, they had imposed what was called war communism, or relocation of resources, redistribution of land, and also industrial plants to the workers. But it leads to a massive famine, which incurs additional millions of more lives as a result of this war communism. Lenin is forced to pull back from this harsh imposition of communism and issue what was called the New Economic Policy. The New Economic Policy was actually a measure of capitalism and free market economics. So even after promising communism, once they took over, Lenin actually adopts a more free market capitalistic system. The best move for Russia that Lenin and the Bolsheviks institute is a peace treaty with the Germans. The very humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was humiliating for Russia because they had lost so much in the course of the war and now are willing to give up control over Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Ukraine, a third of its population, 80% of its iron, and 90% of its coal to Germany. But nevertheless, the war ends for Russia. They pull out of the war and end the millions of lives that were being lost over the course of the war, which helps in small measure for the popularity of the Bolsheviks and Lenin's government. In order to enforce Bolshevik control over Russia, Lenin institutes his version of a secret police that replaces the Tsar's secret police, known as the Cheka. The Cheka enforced Bolshevik rule and often arrested people without charge, put them on trial, and executed them without ever having a trial. This leads to the famous Red Terror, in which any of those who opposed and criticized the Bolshevik government were summarily executed. Lenin is not only content with revolution in Russia, but he also creates the Comintern, which was an organ of the Bolshevik government to export revolution, communist revolution around the world. And indeed, many democratic states in Western Europe and in the United States will fear a communist takeover in the 1920s because of the activities of the Comintern and the fearful legacy of the Russian Revolution that took place in 1917 amidst the trauma of World War I.